Good morning, good afternoon to all of you that have tuned in today. My name is Sudha David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you back to our first Transatlantic Tuesday after the summer break. Transatlantic Tuesdays is a series that brings together important experts from both sides of the Atlantic to discuss pertinent issues related to security, trade, and also elections. And this year, it is a German election year. And we're here to talk about the withdrawal in Afghanistan and what it means for collective security on both sides of the Atlantic, and whether it has an impact on the transatlantic relationship, and of course, the German elections that are coming up on September 26th. Before I hand off to my colleague, Rachel Tausendfreund, who will introduce our speakers today, I'd like to take a minute to thank our Business Alliance partners and also discuss the run of show for today. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please note that this session will be recorded today. Rachel is our editorial director at GMF, and she will moderate this conversation for about 20 minutes. And you could keep the questions going right away. They will queue up automatically, and she will get to them very shortly. Thanks again. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Sudha. Thanks for that introduction. Yes, as Sudha mentioned, 1 week ago today, the United States, and with it NATO, officially ended its involvement in the Afghanistan war, nearly 20 years after it began, following the September 11th attacks of 2001. And in about 2.5 weeks from today, the Germans will go to the polls and for the first time in 16 years, elect a chancellor who will not be Chancellor Merkel. That much is clear. So we're here today to discuss how are these two things related? How is the Afghanistan withdrawal, the ignominious end of this 20-year war, going to affect, first of all, the German elections, if it's going to affect them, and if not, then the future of security and defense in Germany under a new chancellor. This is a special kind of transatlantic Tuesday because we're very Germany heavy. I am American, but I'm also based in Berlin, and I have two German experts with me, but that's because it's election season here. So it's a slightly German-focused Transatlantic Tuesday, but I think there's good reason for that. So now, without further ado, I will introduce you to my speakers. Markus Kaim is a senior fellow in the International Security Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which is commonly referred to as SVP for the German speakers. And also, more importantly than that, he was a Helmut Schmidt Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States in Washington, D.C. From 2019 to 2020. Markus, thanks for joining us. And with Markus and me on the panel is Konstantin von Hammerstein. He's a veteran political journalist at Der Spiegel in Berlin, sort of the main political weekly for the Americans who don't know it. Since 2014, he's reported primarily on the SPD, security and defense policy, and development policy. Previous to that, he was also a radio journalist, including a stint as a Washington correspondent. Konstantin, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So, Markus, I'm going to start with a kind of broad foreign policy picture here. The defense minister of Germany, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, in the sort of midst of the evacuation phase, gave a speech where she argued that despite the collapse at the end, the Afghanistan mission was still the right thing to do. Der Einsatz war richtig was her quote. So, you know, the title of the event is The Failure of the West. So my question is, do you agree with the defense minister? Was the mission right for NATO, right for Germany, and or was it a complete failure?
Let me start by reminding, thank you for having me. Let me start by reminding us all what have been the three major goals of the German Afghanistan endeavor, or the German Afghanistan operation. The first one has been to express solidarity with the United States after 9/11. And I think this goal has been accomplished pretty well. Every time you talk to people in Washington, D.C. or in other places in the United States and mention German contribution to the Afghanistan operation, it's well appreciated. So from this perspective, it's one little piece of the German-US relationship and is regarded as such. The second goal has been to counter terrorism, or to fight transnational Islamic terrorism. And this worked to a certain degree as well. I think Al-Qaeda has not been rooted out completely, but its capacity has been severely diminished. So I would agree with President Biden insofar that the Islamic terrorism is less of a danger than 20 years ago. But the third goal, to build credible, reliable, loyal security forces in Afghanistan as one piece of nation building, or to be more precise, state building, we failed. And we failed tremendously, and as it has been described all over the place over the last couple of weeks, I think we misread, we misinterpreted it, like other governments as well, the real developments on the ground. And to a certain degree, that has led to a major, let's call it, estrangement and disillusionment with the United States and the recent administration. So I would end with a dire picture of estrangement, disillusionment of the US-German relationship, and the disappointment about the future course of US foreign policy here in Berlin.
Interesting. Okay, we're going to pick up on that, and maybe Konstantin, your answer will slightly pick up on this. The team at Spiegel, I believe you were one of the authors, recently wrote, in the midst of this, an article called A Chronicle of German Failures in Afghanistan. So my question to sort of, for you to add on to what Markus said is, where were the German failures in this? So the mission failed in many ways. There's a lot of American ownership of these failures. What are the German particular failures, and how do they sort of relate?
So what we were describing in our article was not the 20 years of the whole mission, but it was just the last month since the Americans stipulated that they wanted to go out of Afghanistan. So basically, it was a failure of crisis management, slow crisis management, not enough foresight, not understanding the dynamic on the ground in Kabul. That was what we were describing in our article. All the warnings of the intelligence services of the American counterparts were actually ignored. And there was a lot of bureaucratic infighting between the ministries who were involved. There are 4 ministries. It's the Foreign Office, of course. It's the Ministry of Interior, which is responsible for visa. It's the Ministry of Defense, and it's the Ministry of Economic Development, and it's the Chancellery. And the Chancellor was pressing for an agreement between the ministries, but the ministries couldn't agree on anything. So it took months and months and months, and so it was a very slow crisis management. And that was basically what we were describing.
In the, starting with, I guess, the failure to interpret the intelligence differently, right? There's stories that the French, for example, pulled a lot of their people who had worked with them out earlier because they had the same intelligence, but they interpreted it differently. And Germany and the United States seem to have interpreted the information they had on the ground in a similar way, in terms of being optimistic about the ability of the Afghan forces to hold their ground and to hold Kabul, at least for a number of months. And then even in the midst of this, there were bureaucratic problems in Germany. In terms of the mission, the vision for the mission overall, aside from solidarity, which I think is an important point, Markus, but the Germans were supposed to be in charge of training the police, I believe. There's this idea of this crazy German word, Ertüchtigung, so like building the capacities of partners on the ground in different areas. And these are ideas that one has to really question now, given how dire the situation so quickly became in Afghanistan after 20 years of effort, certainly US led and designed, but there must be also questions to Germany about this.
Absolutely, and I think I wouldn't complain about the last 6 weeks. As Konstantin pointed out, I think the bigger problem and the darker picture are the last 20 years, because you can blame actually every German government since 2001 about their failures or misinterpretations, misreadings of the situation in Afghanistan, and their failures, what they didn't accomplish and what they failed to do. I think, to make a very long story very short, I think in Germany, we never fully understood the main rationale of the United States, counterterrorism. Because if you read the mandates of the German Bundestag over the last 2 decades, you never get the impression that it's a robust military intervention with the goal of countering terrorism. It's more about a civilian dimension approach, civilian-driven approach. It's about protecting girls, it's about building schools and so on. And I think there's no doubt about that in the United States, there were also ideas about counterinsurgency must include state and nation building, but at the end of the day, the overarching goal was mainly counterterrorism, and that has never been fully embraced by the German authorities, by none of the German governments over the last 20 years. So at the end of the day, there was a huge, to call it surprise or disappointment about what we accomplished here in Afghanistan.
I think we're going to return to sort of that point when we look at the future of what it means for, German foreign and security policy in the next administration and beyond. But first, the bridge to that is German politics right now. So as I said, the defense minister gave this speech in the middle of an evacuation. It was, the sort of collapse of Afghanistan was all over the newspapers, right in the heated phase of the German elections. The first question at the big trilateral debate, the opening question was about Afghanistan. But where are we now? How much of a role is Afghanistan playing in the elections? Does it look like it's going to be a topic heading up to election day? Konstantin.
Well, I just had lunch a couple of hours ago with a very prominent social democrat politician. And he told me that he was campaigning last week in the south of Germany at the shores of Lake Constance. It's a stronghold of the Christian Democrats. He talked to laborers or workers in a factory. And so question number 1 was housing, housing, housing. Question number 2 was how does the transformation of the German economy to climate change or climate neutrality affect our jobs? Question number 3, these were Christian Democrat voters mostly. How can we prevent Armin Laschet, the Christian Democrat chancellor candidate, from becoming chancellor? Of course, I know this was a social democrat. He was sort of a spin doctor, but I think he's quite right. That's exactly what we experience when we visit election campaign events. Afghanistan is not an issue. It's a big issue if you talk, for example, if you're on a dinner party, so everybody is talking about Afghanistan. But the funny thing is, it's not an issue in the election campaign. Why? Because I think all the major parties are sort of involved in this mission. I mean, it was started by the Social Democrats and the Greens. It was supported by the Christian Democrats and by the Liberals. And these are the 4 major parties who are actually competing in these elections, and they are all involved. And it's not a real issue. There's one issue, and I think that's the topic of good governance. And what I mentioned before, the crisis management. There's a lot of debate that's Corona, and it's the flooding catastrophe a couple of weeks ago in West Germany, and it's Afghanistan. Is Germany capable of crisis management? That's an issue, but it's not a foreign policy issue. That's funny, and I think it will stay like this. It won't have very much impact on the outcome of the elections, I think.
Maybe if I
go ahead.
If I may add one idea, And the only two parties which might feel vindicated by the Afghanistan failure are the most extreme parties. The left-wing party, the left, always said we won't participate, we won't agree on any expeditionary mission of the German armed forces, and the AfD on the right wing always said it's not our problem, it's the Afghans' problems, and therefore they might feel vindicated, but they do not have any chance to enter the next German government, or very slight chances to enter the next German government. So, and the key political players agree on not mentioning this issue anymore.
Yeah, I think this is probably an interesting point, right? Not to be cynical, but as everyone is implicated, it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about it. As a quick kind of update, and maybe Konstantin, you want to add to my update with a bit more detail if you want, for those of you who are attending this event but haven't been following the German elections closely. It's a real race, much more of a race than anybody would have thought a year ago, when it looked like it would be another Christian Democrat chancellor with probably the Greens, and the question was just which proportion of both parties, basically. Then for a small moment, early summer, the Greens took the lead, and now and have since, however, decreased their poll numbers. And at the moment, according to current polling, almost out of nowhere, but for the past sort of month on an incline, the Social Democrats are leading the polls and the Christian Democrats are sinking. So we have interesting, first of all, a really unclear outcome at this point. And second of all, interesting coalition constellations that look like we're probably looking at a three-party coalition. And this is where the left party, at least for a moment in the aftermath of the evacuation and in that first debate, because they might be a potential coalition party, the very smallest coalition party in a left-wing coalition, but they did not agree to the Afghanistan evacuation effort, which was a pretty the German evacuation effort, which was a pretty publicized effort, which I think had a lot of sort of support among the population, and all of the parties, of the big three parties, were distancing themselves from the left-wing position. So, Konstantin, I don't know if you want to add anything to that picture and whether or not any of it matters in the coalition building for the background of our panelists.
Well, at the moment, the polls are quite clear. The Social Democrats are around 25%. The Christian Democrats are around 20%. The Greens are around 16 to 17%. Liberals and the right-wing AfD around 12%, and the left-wing party, the leftists, at 6%. So if it stays like this, and mail-in voting has already begun, and what people in the party headquarters tell me is that the raw data is even more clear, has even a more clear picture than the publicized polls for the Social Democrats. That would mean probably a Social Democrat chancellor. And in a three-party coalition, the most likely outcome would be a so-called traffic light coalition, which means the red Social Democrats together with the Greens and the yellow Liberals. But there might be even different combinations, but I guess this is the most likely outcome.
So
and
everyone,
that's fascinating, because as you mentioned just a couple of weeks ago, nobody would think about or even dream about, not even the Social Democrats, that a Social Democrat politician might have a chance to become the next chancellor.
Yeah. There's been a lot of movement in this elections. Quite an participate question. I just want to remind everyone, just put your questions in the Q&A and I will keep looking at it. And Markus, I'm going to ask this question and add a small point of my own to it. So the question is, will the Afghan experience and the domestic crisis, like the flooding that was mentioned, refocus Germany internally to domestic issues and maybe EU issues and less on faraway endeavors? But I would add to that the issue of, participation was refocusing attention on this idea of German capability and European capability, right? If the Europeans aren't even able to get their own people out without the support of the US, is this not an indication of needing more European capability? So I would sort of combine those questions to you and say, are we looking at an EU focus maybe, or a completely domestic focus as a result of Afghanistan?
Okay, very good question. I tried to give an answer. I mean, what we have seen here from Berlin, when we look to Washington, D.C. over the last couple of weeks regarding Afghanistan, was an US president mentioning domestic priorities. It's about our national interests. And the German politicians have been very disappointed, but they listened quite carefully. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of the answers, German foreign policy after the election, the German foreign policy of the next government, will look like more, or not the foreign policy, the policy approach in general will be way more inward-looking, domestically oriented, after so little has been accomplished in Afghanistan. I mean, we have to keep in mind, Afghanistan has the biggest operation of the German armed forces ever after 1945, and it ended with a huge disappointment. So one necessary, almost logical conclusion for the German political class will be never again. And I cannot really imagine any circumstances, any crisis in the, let's call it, foreseeable future in which German politicians will be ready to deploy forces for such a long-standing military operation, long-lasting military operation. Point one. Point two, as I mentioned before, there's some kind of disappointment about the Biden administration, maybe not about the withdrawal as such, but the way it was conducted, about not being informed by the US administration. And therefore, another maybe logical conclusion would be, maybe the French are correct that we cannot rely on the United States anymore. And that explains why a handful of politicians, Armin Laschet, Norbert Röttgen, and a handful of others, have raised the idea of European autonomy, European strategic autonomy, European strategic sovereignty again and again. And it has been on the agenda of the EU foreign ministers meeting last week, Thursday and Friday. However, I heard that so many times without any consequences, although I would love to see more steps towards bigger military ambitions, bigger military capabilities within the framework of the European Union, or my preference would be as a European pillar of NATO. I have my doubts, because my analysis about German politics becoming more inward-looking, becoming more insular, that applies to other European countries as well. And despite the title which was given to the recent commission by Ursula von der Leyen, now we'll have a geopolitical commission with a geopolitical outlook to the world. I have my doubts, and I think the major outlook of the European foreign policy will be more or less exactly the opposite, not geopolitical, but provincial.
Konstantin, I would sort of direct the same question to you with a more party-specific lens. So you focus on the SPD, and traditionally, I think one could say that the Christian Democrats tend to be more transatlantic focused, and the SPD is potentially transatlantic, a little more EU focused or pro-European. Do you think after the election, there'll be a new strategic conversation about maybe strategic autonomy, to use the French term, or German, and how do you think it might depend on if we have a Chancellor Scholz, or if we have, for example, a significant CDU role in the new government? Do you see a difference there, or the Greens for that matter? The Greens, there's a question here because the Greens have recently brought up the nuclear issue. There's the question about the tornado. So any of that in the party landscape, do you see a difference in strategic conversations that might happen?
Actually, not really. Not really, but just to come back to these kind of missions like Afghanistan. A couple of weeks ago, we did an interview for the Spiegel with Gerhard Schröder, the chancellor who sent in 2002 the first German soldiers to Afghanistan, and he said one of the lessons of Afghanistan would be that these kind of missions, 20 years of stabilizing or nation building, that's gone, that's over. That Western states or Western countries like Germany would only intervene for a short mission to fight against terrorism or a actually military threat. And I think that's the great consensus in German politics. I mean, social democrats or Christian Democrats, everybody. I mean, even the Christian Democrats are now questioning the Mali mission. Norbert Wöttgen, for example, the Christian Democrat chair of the Foreign Committee of the Bundestag, just said, well, we have to talk or debate about the Mali mission. So I think I would say probably we're going to stay in Mali, but no more missions like this. So this is a big, I would say, consensus from all the parties. Of course, they are in certain points they are different, as you have mentioned. The Christian Democrats are more transatlantic, and the Social Democrats are more orientated to have good relationship with Russia, for example, or to stay in conversation with the Russians. But on the major questions, I think there's a big consensus between the four parties, and maybe the style of foreign policy will change under a different chancellor under a different coalition, but the substance of foreign policy won't change, not at all. It's a little bit boring, I have to.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a good news or bad news. I guess it could be worse, but could be better. I have a very specific question from Robert Bell that I'll give to either one of you who want to answer it, which is, has the Green Party taken a firm position on tornado replacement and whether with a new aircraft, Germany will remain in NATO's DCA nuclear posture, as AKK Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the defense minister, has recommended? So I don't know, Markus, if you want to take that one.
I'll try. As far as I remember, and I hope correctly, there's no clear stance of the Green Party regarding the tornado replacement. I think they didn't rule it out, but it's closely connected to any initiative regarding arms control and disarmament. And just yesterday or the day before yesterday, Annalena Baerbock made the point that she would be ready to discuss this issue, but it would be necessary to start a new initiative regarding nuclear arms control and disarmament within the framework of NATO. She didn't explain in precise terms what she had in mind, but I think that would be some kind of deal in any future German government to say, okay, given the transatlantic security dependence we face, we agree on replacing the tornadoes, but for political reasons, it has to be balanced with a new arms control or disarmament initiative.
Exactly. They don't like it, and that's what they tell you. They don't like it, but they will go along with it. And they are much more pragmatic than the Social Democrats on this issue.
We should probably, I should have done this before, but for any non-experts listening to this panel, tell everyone what the tornadoes are.
Tornadoes are a very old fighter jet who have to be replaced, and the nuclear burden sharing is connected to the tornadoes, because the tornadoes are transporting US nuclear bombs. So if you have to replace the tornadoes as a fighter jet, you also have to discuss whether you will you're going to continue the nuclear burden sharing, and that's the point of the debate.
You'll have new planes that can also still carry or are built to carry US weapons.
They just the Ministry of Defense just took the decision this year to replace the Tornado, part of the Tornadoes, with American F-18 fighter jets.
And it has a technical dimension, but in wide circles here in Berlin, it's perceived as one element or one illustration of US-German security cooperation and solidarity. And therefore, it's a very touchy issue, because not renewing the Tornadoes and abolishing nuclear sharing would be perceived, or could be perceived, as some kind of decoupling of Germany from the United States in security terms. Therefore, it's quite a touchy issue.
I have another question from the viewers, which is, I mean, you both touched on it a bit, but there was, I saw at least in the reaction to the Afghanistan withdrawal and the problems that were involved, and then the German evacuation mission, and the fact that there wasn't maybe as much finger pointing toward the US in this being, only a US failure than we might have seen in the past. So I saw a kind of taking on of responsibility for Afghanistan among the German politicians and public in a way that for me wasn't obvious that it was going to happen this way. And but you both seem to think that in the new government, this is not going to transfer in. So we're not seeing a sort of new phase of German foreign policy where Germany feels responsible as as one of the biggest powers in the world to have this classic Germany needs to take more foreign and security policy responsibility in the world. I found the debate around this to be indicating that you have a new understanding of Germany in the world. But both of your answers made it seem like with the new administration, after things like Afghanistan, we might expect German foreign policy to again withdraw and not be interested in a kind of more robust and powerful role in the world. So maybe you could address that.
I think the military won't play a big role. I mean, that's over, but that doesn't mean that Germany won't be active. And it's more on the development side. I mean,
but that's the sort of classic.
Sure. And yeah. I guess if the Social Democrats and the Greens will govern, it will return to this kind of German classic. But it doesn't mean that Germany will sort of Germany first and won't be involved in foreign policy, not at all. But it's not the military side, where Germany never was very strong. And I think on the other point, that there's also a consensus to engage and to put a lot of money at it and try to diplomatic measures, and that won't change.
Markus, what do you think? We're going to return to or stay steady with a civilian power Germany who's trying to do as little as possible in the military realm?
I'm not sure, but let me tell you what I'm thinking about. Maybe that's pure speculation, but maybe one conclusion from what happened in the last couple of weeks for the German foreign policy elites would be, okay, we've seen a US administration referring to US national interest in conducting US foreign policy. Maybe it's a good idea for Germany to define German national interests and to follow German national interests in pursuing German foreign policy. And the interesting point would be that it's very likely to lead to more US-German tensions than cooperation. Imagine a non-military sphere, the German relationship with China. It's quite easy for a new German government to say, okay, it was your interest, your national interest to withdraw your troops from Afghanistan, but now it's our national interest to pursue very close bilateral trade relations with China, which would be detrimental to US-China rivalry. It would be confrontational in the US-German relationship. So maybe this is one of the necessary conclusions to become more sober, to become more realistic in a more geopoliticized world, and maybe this is the necessary conclusion for the next government.
Interesting. We have a question from Jim Colby, who's a GMFer actually, about Russian interference and sort of Russian communication and propaganda efforts in Germany around maybe specifically the context of Afghanistan. So in the last elections, there was this story, Diesel, from the sort of Russian girl supposedly in Germany, and propaganda around her being attacked by refugees. It was all sort of made up disinformation from Russian sources, but it did have an impact in the election. This isn't necessarily a focus of either of you, but to what extent do you see any of this happening or expect Russia to be playing a role in disinformation efforts in the German election?
I think they play a strong role in disinformation, but it doesn't play such a big role in the election campaign. I think just today or yesterday, there was a report that I think Annalena Baerbock, the Green candidate, was mostly victim of fake news. 70% of all fake news concerning the elections were around the Greens, and probably this would come from a Russian source, because the Greens are very, very critical about Russia and China, and so they have a point to distribute fake news about her. Laschet was also in focus, but not so much as the Greens. And the funny thing is that the Social Democrats or Olaf Scholz was not a victim of fake news at all. So it is an issue, but it's not as strong as last time.
Interesting. So we have another question. Great job, by the way, to our questions. Always the worst when the moderator has to do all of the question asking. Scholz, the SPD candidate, just met with Emmanuel Macron. Do you think he was trying to send a message with that? Do we expect, some kind of shift there? And are the Germans and the French closer to agreeing than they were 2 years ago?
Markus, you want to answer?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure, but I found it interesting. Before the summer break, before the summer vacation, there was a debate among the three candidates only about foreign policy issues in the German TV. And the first question was, if you would be elected chancellor, where would your first trip to go to? Armin Laschet said, I won't tell. Annalena Baerbock said Brussels. And Olaf Scholz said Paris. And I think we shouldn't overestimate these kind of statements, but I think it illustrates that he considers still France to be the prime part of Germany in European integration, maybe in foreign policy in general, and in creating something like a European pole in a multipolar world. And I think he has not told us any details about his plans for further integration, security and defense, and he didn't lay out plans for foreign policy initiatives for solving the conflict in the Donbass. But I think this overall, at least foreign policy approach or international relations approach seems to be that he's resting his foreign policy on a close German-Franco cooperation.
And actually, you have to mention that Armin Laschet is traveling to Paris tomorrow.
Oh, sure.
That's true. Yes. To be balanced, I should mention that. So we're approaching the deadline. So I'm gonna ask two questions, and then you get to choose which one you want to answer. Or you could try to answer both, but you have both approximately 2.5 minutes to do so. So one is from a participant, a very big picture question, which is, if you look back at the Merkel chancellorship, would you say that there was some kind of overarching foreign policy doctrine or framework that was consistent in German policy for the last 16 years? And if so, what was it? And how much might this change? Will it persist if there's a new powerful CDU? Will it persist regardless of who is the chancellor? Or can we expect some kind of different posture? I mean, Konstantin, you sort of hinted that you think nothing is going to change, but big picture in terms of doctrine, is there going to be a doctrine? The second optional question that you could answer if you prefer is the refugee question. So there was a small moment when the Christian Democrats were saying 2015 can't be repeated in the Afghanistan crisis, where it looked like the topic of refugees was going to become a political topic in this election. That sort of quickly went away. We don't yet have large numbers of refugees making it to Germany, or decisions that need to be sort of critically need to be made right now with German partners or NATO partners like Turkey or the neighboring countries. But it's likely that it will be an issue, I think. So, you know, how soon will it become an issue, and how dramatic of an issue for Germany and for the EU do you think the refugees, the Afghanistan refugees, will become? So either or both of those questions in our final round. I'm going to start with you, Konstantin, because I started with Markus initially.
Okay, maybe I take the refugee question. So the big picture is for Markus. Public opinion is completely divided on the refugee questions. Half of Germans say we have to help Afghan refugees. The other half says, well, better keep them out of Germany. It doesn't play a strong role in the election campaign. It seemed to play a role just in the beginning, because some politicians like Armin Laschet mentioned it, that and Horst Seehofer, the Minister of Interior as well, that they said, well, we can't repeat 2015, which means open borders and anything. But of course the right wing AfD wants to profit from this topic, but it doesn't really gain traction. Why? Because refugees are not coming. They are not even leaving Afghanistan. I mean, they might leave Afghanistan the next month or in the next years, but at the moment because the Taliban don't let them out, the neighboring countries close their borders. So it's at the moment, at least, it's a complete different picture than 2015 with the Syrians, when they were actually in Europe and coming to Germany and other countries. So it's not an issue. It won't become an issue in the next 2 weeks. So it won't affect the elections at all, I guess. But maybe next year it will be a big topic. But nobody knows how this will play out. It will still deepen the divisions inside Europe, because the European countries, some European countries want to be helpful, at least a little bit, like the Germans, but most European countries won't. So I'm not a prophet. It's difficult to have a prediction how this will play out, but it might be that it will be a stronger topic next year, but not now. Not for the foreseeable future.
Thanks. So, Markus,
okay,
what was the Merkel doctrine and how will it change?
30 things on the Merkel doctrine. I think what is interesting that with the end of the Merkel years, a couple of books have been published, political biographies of her life and her career. And all of them had tried to develop or to identify something like a Merkel doctrine in foreign policy. And in my view, all of them failed for obvious reasons. Because I think the idea of a long-term vision, of a strategic concept, of a clear manifestation of a doctrine is quite alien to Angela Merkel. She's more the incremental crisis solving person, crises have to be approached as they come. And I think it's pretty obvious, but that's a long-standing German foreign policy tradition that she's multilateralist, but that's not surprising. That she's pro-European and considers to be a working, functioning, effective European Union as the pillar or cornerstone of the EU foreign policy. Same applies to transatlantic relations. Therefore, I think she's in a long-standing tradition of German foreign policy. And here at the end, I would agree with Konstantin. I cannot imagine any German chancellor in the next years, be it Olaf Scholz or be it Armin Laschet, to deviate from this path of German foreign policy.
Also, be it Annalena Baerbock, so also the Greens, if something again dramatic happens in the polls, will not have a fundamentally different German foreign policy.
Okay, very good.
Okay, well, we will end there because we're almost on time, just 1 minute late. So thank you all very much for joining us to talk about Afghanistan and German politics. We'll be keeping a close watch, I am sure, on what is happening with the German poll numbers for the next 2.5 weeks. Thank you again to Markus Kaim from SVP and from Konstantin von Hammerstein from the Spiegel for joining us to talk about security and defense policy and German politics and the world after Afghanistan.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.